Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. Well, and this is the Sony MDR-MV1. This is the first new Sony open back headphone in a long time. Frankly, as long as I've been into the hobby, the only Sony open back headphones I hear about are classics that are discontinued now, like the legendary MA900. And when the MV1 was announced, well, frankly, I was pretty optimistic that this could be a future legend itself, so I plonked down for the pre-order, and for the past couple of weeks, I've been listening to and living with the Sony MV1 and comparing it with some other headphones in its price range, which is $400 in case you weren't sure, and I'm ready to let you know what I think. So, like all of my other reviews, this is a live stream, hence the recent technical difficulties. But that means if you've got any questions about the MV1 that I don't answer here in this review, you can stick around in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have some time for back and forth Q&A session and hopefully answer all of your burning questions. But with that all out of the way, I guess if you're interested in checking out the MV1, I do have it linked in the description down below. But let's just dive to the table and start talking about the physical stuff on this headphone. We'll talk about the build quality, we'll talk about what comes inside the box, and we'll get into talking about the sound signature, what I like, what I don't like, and then we're going to bring in a handful of competitors so you know exactly where I think this thing stacks up. All right, so first of all, what do you get in the box? This is the box itself. And I think the first thing that's kind of interestingly notable is how insubstantial this box is. When this thing came, I honestly didn't think that was the headphone because it's so small versus, you know, like the box you get with the Sennheiser HD600. It's like this big, massive, hulking thing. And well, that's pretty small, but I don't know. That's okay. I don't need the box. I need what's inside the box. And what you get inside the box is, okay, not a ton either. You get the headphone and you get a cable and you get a little cable adapter. Let's talk more about this cable. As far as headphone cables go, this is actually a pretty nice cable, if I'm honest. It's punching on that so you can kind of get a sense for what's going on here. It's got this kind of like ribbed textured plastic on it. And it's just a really well-behaved cable. You're not going to totally be able to tell because probably my biggest complaint about this cable is that it's just a little bit too long, at least for the type of usage that I intend to use for this thing, right? I'm more of a portable listener, so a 4-foot cable is more my speed. This is about an 8-foot long cable, maybe even a little bit longer than 8 foot, so probably optimized for use in like a studio of sorts. And to that end, it also terminates in a 6.3 millimeter connector, which again, if you're in a studio, is probably a good thing. For me, it's not the best. So what they do include is this 6.3 millimeter to 3.5 millimeter pigtail adapter. And that's a decent solution, I suppose, in a pinch, but for everyday usability and stuff like that, this cable is just unfortunately not really optimal for me. Again, mostly it's just because it's too long, and this 6.3 millimeter interconnect is not what I want for my portable usage. That said, it does use a standard, or at least mostly standard, 3.5 millimeter connector here to plug into the headphone itself, as you can see, and you can easily get this. Maybe notable, this has 4 poles on it, you might notice. I used this successfully with just standard 3-pole headphone cables, as well as this is what I ended up ordering for myself as a replacement. This is a cable from Heart Audio, which does actually thankfully terminate in 4 poles as well, although again, didn't seem so necessary. That said, all right, enough about the cable. Let's talk about this headphone, okay? And honestly, you know, as much as the legends behind the other Sony headphones was behind the fact that I pre-ordered this, the other thing that was really behind me pre-ordering this headphone is just the aesthetic. I friggin' love the way this headphone looks. And at least in pictures and in the flesh, I think it lives very much up to those expectations. It's kind of got a classic Sony headphone look. If you're familiar with things like this is a Sony MDR-MV1. This is a headphone that is in studios all around the world. If you're familiar with that look, that is kind of the aesthetic here that they're going for with the MV1, but it's got kind of a back to the futuresque 80s modern vibe to it. The cup designs, again, are pretty reminiscent of that other headphone, but they are hyper ventilated, as you can see, because this is an open back headphone. Other things that are different about it, well, you've got kind of a similar headband design up here. In fact, it's got these familiar colored L and R's, as well as the blue professional sticker on it. But the headband is also pretty different from the headband that you get on the old V6. As you can see here, this is pretty thin and lightly padded. It's fine, it's plenty comfortable, but this is definitely on the plusher side versus that. Also, they've got, we're talking about things that are plush and beefy, these pads right here are pretty thick. I think they also kind of contribute to the modernization, but they also just contribute to a better fitting headphone generally versus the other Sony studio headphones. The pad is a micro suede, which is actually my favorite material for a pad. It does maybe pick up a little bit of lint because of that. It's just like this soft, kind of like almost like a microfiber material. But it is super comfy, and then the pads themselves are a very soft foam. As you can see, it's not like a slow recovery memory foam or anything like that. In fact, it's a very lightweight foam, but it does contribute to, I guess overall, it is a very lightweight headphone, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. The only thing that this thing doesn't do that these headphones do that's kind of impressive, right? These things have, right, the old Sony classic headphones have this really neat folding mechanism, and there's nothing like that here on the MV1. The only folding is that the cups do fold flat. They only fold flat in one direction, and unfortunately it's the wrong direction for me. I like to wear them around my neck and have the cups fold against my chest. They fold away from my chest. Small quibble, but I'm gonna quibble about it every time that is the case. Other than that, okay, all right, I mentioned briefly that these things are extremely lightweight. Okay. These things are insanely lightweight. They are only 220 grams, which if that doesn't mean anything to you, these things are actually lighter than Sony's Bluetooth WH-1000XM5, which if you've tried that headphone, it is an insanely light and comfortable headphone. It's kind of what it's optimized for. And this thing's actually even lighter. Again, 220 grams. That's super light. AirPods Max, I remember this number for some reason. I think those are 385 grams. Just to put this thing into context. So generally that's pretty impressive. Now, as you might expect, because it is so lightweight, the build quality on this thing is frankly made up of a lot of plastic. The yokes up here, this is all plastic. The headband here is plastic. Obviously, this right here is a steel band. The only real bits of kind of like metal material on this, apart from the steel band that's going underneath the headband, is actually these outer cups, which the cup frame is a plastic, but this outer area here appears to be kind of like a really thin, lightweight metal, maybe a magnesium or something like that. They don't exactly advertise it, but yeah, it's just, this thing is totally optimized and built and optimized for being a lightweight and comfortable headphone, and much less so for being a plush, I don't know, expensive feeling headphone. Despite the fact that it does cost $400, which is not cheap, it doesn't necessarily feel like a $400 headphone, but it does feel super comfy, and I'm not mad at that. It's a trade-off, and I'm definitely not mad at that. Let me throw this on my head so you can take a look at what the MV1 looks like on my head. And like I mentioned, it's super lightweight. I don't think there's any issues with like clamp or anything like that. And the pads are nice and cushy. Again, they're not like a memory foam, so it's kind of a lightweight. I don't even know if you can, I haven't looked at this on my own head, how much they compress on the head, but there you go. Yeah, there's plenty of room in the ear cups. I don't have any issues with my ears touching them, and they're also a pretty deep ear pad. Let's go back to the table and I can show you that it is a relatively deep ear pad. It's not especially large and spacious in here, but I really have no issues with my ears touching any part of this. And in combination with the extreme lightweight, again, I just find this to be a super comfortable headphone. This is a headphone you can wear all day, every day, and never have any complaints about it. So I think, honestly, that's as much as I can talk about the build and the physical stuff on this headphone. So let's just dive in and talk about this sound here on the Sony MV1. And, well, I started by comparing this a little bit to the Sony closed-backed, right? Their studio headphones, the MDR-V6, the MDR-7506. These are like super ubiquitous headphones that you will see in studios around the world. And ostensibly, this is like sort of an open back version of that. Thankfully, in my opinion at least, these things do not really sound like those other headphones. If you've heard those headphones, I find them, especially the 7506, just incredibly bright headphones, which is not necessarily a bad quality for monitoring like vocal production and stuff like that, but for music listening, I find those other Sony Studio headphones just not super pleasant. Again, thankfully the MV1 is not that. In fact, what the sound signature is on these is kind of surprising, actually, for especially an open back headphone. This is, I would describe, kind of a bassy V-shaped sound signature. Open backs really just are not known for bass. In fact, I can't really think of a headphone that has as much bass, at least sub bass, as these. I can't think of any open back headphone out there that does. And it's really pretty impressive, again, for open back headphones. And I will say though, although the bass is primarily focused in the sub bass, it doesn't lack in mid bass. It is still a fairly full and warm sounding headphone. The mid bass is not anemic, but also thankfully it's not like overwhelming. I think it's pretty well balanced with the treble. It gives it kind of a slightly contrasty V-shaped sound signature that honestly I dig it quite a bit. So what do I like about the sound here on the MV1? Honestly, a lot of it. So for the amount of bass on this headphone, it is actually surprisingly strong on clarity. It sounds tonally correct. There's nothing awkward with vocals, which still feel present even and not, crowded out by the bass as a bassy headphone can often sound. There is clean separation between instruments. Frankly, it just does not come across muddy at all. One thing that will stand out, if you look at frequency responses of this headphone, and I've actually got it graphed on squig.link, linked in the description if you want to check it out. The graphs show kind of an aggressive amount of treble, to be honest, but I don't think the treble is actually a problem on this headphone at all. I think that the treble that's here is present. It cuts through the low end well, and it adds to that sense of clarity, and it does it without ever being sharp or uncomfortable. Generally, I would describe the MV1 as a smooth, easy listen. Again, a surprising sense of clarity on it, and just no issues with zinginess, sibilance, etc. If you're worried about the treble that you see on the graph, in my opinion, you don't need to be worried about it. This is not like biodynamic treble on this headphone, despite what you might see in the graph. And of course, what I like about the sound on this headphone is the bass. If you're looking for an open back headphone that thumps, this is honestly pretty impressive. Again, there are not a lot of open back headphones that have a ton of bass. Typically, they will have at best linear bass, and a lot of times they will roll off in the sub bass. This one actually has a bass shelf that continues rising from 1K hertz all the way down to 20 hertz. It is really pretty impressive. And the bass is, I would say, well controlled. The mid-bass attack is maybe not the best defined, but it definitely avoids smearing in the mid-range or anything like that. And as mentioned, the sub-bass really is the focus of this bass emphasis. And it digs deep in a way that, again, I don't expect of open back headphones. So what do I not like about the sound on the MV1? And if I'm honest, there's not a ton that I don't like on this. Generally the cost that you will get of that bassy V-shaped sound signature, or basically when you're talking about kind of a contrasty V-shape, right? The cost is going to be micro contrast, right? You're gaining macro contrast and losing a little bit of micro contrast. And I think that is true here of the MV1. This does not index especially high for things like detail and texturing, if that's what you're looking for in your sound signature, which means if you're looking for like the best vocal presentation, the MV1 it's not gonna be it. Vocals do come across a little bit, I think, hollow, and lack some of the richness that I usually like in some of my other headphones. And then similarly, I think the technical performance on this headphone is adequate, but it's not impressive, right? Imaging on the MV1, it's average. Soundstage is perfectly average. And like I mentioned, it's not going to impress with detail retrieval. So I would say that it's all very solid in terms of technical performance, but it is not especially impressive anywhere if that's what you're looking for. So those are my general thoughts here on the MV1, but let's put it in context, right? I've been listening to this and comparing it with the HD600, which I've got sitting right here, the Sennheiser HD600. This is a $400 headphone, also a dynamic driver. I think I forgot to mention that, both of these dynamic drivers. I've also been listening to it versus the Beyerdynamic DT900 Pro X, $260, so quite a bit cheaper, but also a dynamic driver. And then finally, been listening to it versus the HiFiMan Edition XS. This one's $500, but it is a planar driver. And well, that is what will be compared here if I can fit these things all on my camera. And if I can't, well, we're just gonna make do, all right? Use your imagination as best as possible. Let me make sure that Sony cup is showing because it's so dang cool looking. All right, let's do this comparison, all right? Okay, actually, just off the bat, let me start by describing how hard these things are to drive, because that is a difference that matters to a lot of people. The Sony MV1, actually very, very easy to drive. This thing you can run off of a phone. I was playing it on my MiU Mini Plus, little gaming handheld. This thing is super easy to drive. The HD600 is somewhat difficult to drive. I'm still able to drive this thing plenty fine off my M1 MacBook Air, but if you're looking to run this thing off of a phone or even like an Apple dongle, it's going to feel a little bit anemic there. The Beyerdynamic DT900, I would say, is also very easy to drive. Not quite as easy as the MV1, but a very easy to drive headphone that you should be able to run on any portable source. And then finally here, the HiFiMan Edition XS, I would say, is similar to the HD600 in its drivability, and that, again, it will run perfectly fine off of my MacBook, but off of a phone and even off of the MiU Mini was a little bit on the anemic side. Okay, but let's talk about how these things compare in terms of sound signature. The MV1, which I just got done describing, is a bassy V-shaped sound signature. It's strong on clarity, from macro contrast and surprising amounts of bass. That is what you should expect from the MV1. The HD600, in contrast, is a mid-range masterclass, is how I would best describe this thing. It's got the right amount of warmth in the vocals, but overall a forward vocal presentation with just zero sense of stridency in the treble. The bass does roll off here on the HD600, but it's decently present, and I think overall it just does not come across as like a thin bass light headphone, despite the fact that it doesn't have a lot of bass. And just overall, I think that the timbre on this thing is top tier because the tuning is so excellent. The DT900 Pro X is actually kind of similar to the HD600 in a lot of ways, but I would describe this as a little bit brighter, especially in sort of the mid-treble region. With better bass extension as well. That little bit of brightness, I think, brings out a little bit more texturing in vocals versus this, but it does come at just the risk of being a little bit strident. For the most part, I don't find this thing to be fatiguing or sharp or anything like that, but if you are sensitive to treble, do be warned that this one is the most treble emphasized of the bunch here on the table. And then finally, the Edition XS. This is classic HiFiMan neutral sound signature, which is a little bit lean, a little bit thin in the body, kind of a more clinical sound signature versus these, which these are all kind of like different flavors of neutral. This is like the clinical bodiless neutral, okay? I would say that this has the most upper treble. Like if you're looking for treble extension, that's going to be the most emphasized here on the XS. And honestly, despite the fact that I described this as kind of thin, it does actually have surprising amount of bass presence, despite that clinical sound signature. So that's kind of how they compare in terms of sound signature. If I'm picking up a personal favorite, like it's still going to be the HD600. But all of these have something that like brings me back to them. These are all very enjoyable listens, and the MV1 does stand out for having just the most different sound signature, right? I would not really describe this as neutral, although its tuning is, again, normal enough that you could be confused for describing that as neutral. Okay, let's talk about how they compare in terms of technical performance. The MV1, again, I would say is perfectly adequate, but unimpressive. If you're new to open back headphones, I think you're going to be in for a treat with something like the MV1, but assuming this isn't your first go in with modest expectations, I think you're going to be satisfied. It's got, again, a decent sense of imaging, decent sense of head stage, good separation between sounds and well-defined bass, but it's just not going to be super impressive. The HD600 honestly is kind of similar, right? I think it does better at pulling out things like texture. I think the micro contrast is a little bit more present here on the HD600. Okay, a lot more present here on the HD600. It just gives out, I think, a better sense of transparency to the sound. The bass quality is not necessarily better. I think the bass is better here on the MV1, but that is kind of the trade-off, the classic trade-off of the Sennheiser headphone. The Beyerdynamic DT900, I would say it's pretty similar to the HD600. It's very good with texturing. It can come across maybe a little bit gritty and digital in comparison to the HD600, so I think the timbre is not quite as clean on the set, but it does gain deeper bass tones, and I think maybe the bass attack on the set is maybe a little bit softer than it is here on the MV1. Now finally, the Edition XS. In terms of technical performance, this is really standout at this price range. I was recently kind of got into a little bit of like Japanese jazz music. Oh my gosh, Ponto Box or something like that is the specific artist I've been listening to. And the Edition XS in that context kind of blows away the others, if I'm perfectly honest, in terms of just a clean separation of sounds and a really lifelike reproduction of just the full dynamic range of the music. It is utterly transparent. The technical performance is really pretty impressive. Now, I think the bass is also not the most emphasized here on the Edition XS, but it is the best quality bass. Just got a nice tightness to it, and again, it digs really well deep. With some other music that I'm listening to that's not Japanese jazz, I think that this can come across maybe lacking a little bit of body and lacking a little bit of engagement, but overall, I think that this is pretty clearly the best performing in terms of technical performance here on the table. Now, in terms of form factor, and move these aside and make room for them one-on-one, the MV1, this is my favorite looking headphone here on the bunch. I think this thing is just gorgeous. I don't know. I don't know if this totally comes across here on camera, but this is just like the perfect balance of a classic aesthetic with, again, kind of like this Back to the Future semi-futuristic vibe to it. That just, it works really well. Again, it's a really lightweight headphone, which makes it super comfortable. It does come at the risk of maybe feeling a little bit cheap in the hand, depending on, you know, exactly what your expectations are going in, but I overall really have no qualms with the build quality on this headphone. The one thing I will mention, I actually forgot to mention this when I was talking about the cable, this is a pretty microphonic headphone, okay? The cable connects into here, and if that cable is rubbing against your shirt, the sounds of that cable rubbing will get transmitted into the cup a little bit more aggressively here on the MV1 than on these other headphones. When I was listening to music, it wasn't really a problem. When I was using these to do like video calls and stuff like that is where I found it the most annoying, but generally, yeah, really happy with the build on that headphone. The Sennheiser HD600, let's just take a look and behold this headphone in its gorgeous, that's right, Resolve, gorgeous marble countertop look. Unfortunately, you can't get it in this marble countertop look anymore. They still sell this headphone, but it comes in a pretty cool looking gray, but I think this is the look to go for. Honestly, it's a little bit ugly, but I love it. I love the way this thing looks. In terms of fit and comfort, I guess I'll throw this thing on my head while we're talking about it. The HD600 is, I find, one of the most comfortable headphones. And it's just like, it fits snug, like I'm being hugged around my head. Some people complain about the clamp pressure on this thing, which I don't know. Maybe it's just because I've had this thing now for a few years. I don't have any issues with the clamp pressure. And the ear pads, as you can see, are quite large and voluminous, right? There is plenty of room in there. Let's compare it versus the room here on the MV1, which is certainly adequate in its spaciousness, but I think these are a little bit more spacious. Yeah, I really love the build on these things. And they are all also plastic build, but they feel maybe a little bit more substantial than something like this, but of course that comes with the penalty of them being slightly heavier, but I don't think anyone's gonna complain about the weight on those. Okay, the Beyerdynamic DT900 Pro X. For being the cheapest headphone here on the table, it really does not come across at all in terms of build quality. I think this thing really is a well-built headphone, and I think it's also really handsome. I don't know, there's something about the way that these cups kind of close on each other that I really dig. And the materials are all really nice. You've got these metal yokes here. The back is, okay, this is a plastic cup, but you've got just a nice sturdy headband. And in terms of comfort, I would say that the 900 Pro X is also very comfortable. The ear pads, because they're round, aren't quite as well fitted to my head as something like the Sonys and the Sennheisers, but I don't know, that's really getting pretty quibbly because generally I find this to be a fairly lightweight headphone, no serious clamp pressure, and again, plenty of room in the ear cups for my ears. Finally, let's talk about the Hyphaman Edition XS in terms of form factor. I don't know if this is totally coming across. This headphone is freaking huge, okay? This is a big old headphone. But build quality is what I would say is the weak point of this headphone. Not necessarily that I'm worried about it falling apart or anything like that, but it definitely feels the cheapest here on the table. I don't know if you can kind of see, it's like a little wobbly, a little rattly. You know, it feels the cheapest, just a little floppy, if I'm honest. And it feels a little bit delicate, but again, I don't know. I'm not really worried about this thing falling apart. In terms of fit and comfort, well, I don't think anyone's gonna have any complaints about this thing not being comfortable because it fits very large, as you can see on my head, and there is plenty of room in these voluminous, look at that, ear pads for your ear. You're not going to have any issues with this thing touching your ears, and weight is also pretty light on this headphone because the cups are, now this is all plastic basically. The yoke here is a metal, but you've got this soft kind of crinkly foam up here. Yeah, I don't know. Again, build quality is not the strength of this headphone, but it is lightweight and comfy. The only thing that I will kind of warn people about with this headphone is because it is so large, it might not actually work very well for people with small heads. Well, okay, let's put this into context. I'm listening to, or I use my Sennheiser HD600 with that level of adjustment. I think it's like 7 notches, okay? The MDR-MV1, I've got it at notch 5 out of 10. So I basically got this halfway to its maximum size, and that's probably about as true for the Fire Dynamics. These I've got on their smallest size. Well, okay, it's 1 notch below or 1 notch beyond their smallest size, but I could wear these things on their smallest size and it would perfectly fit my head. So if you've got a smaller head than me, you might be swimming in these headphones. So that's just, I guess, a fair warning. But that is going to do it for my comparisons here with these headphones. And that will bring us to the conclusion with the Sony MDR-MV1. Is it a legendary headphone? I guess time will tell, but I really do think that this is kind of an instant classic. Like it's got the look and it delivers. It maybe is not the best in terms of detail and technical performance versus these other headphones, but unlike any other open back headphone that I can really think of, this has got really good quality bass on it. And I think because of that, it's kind of got its own place in the market. And out of 5 stars, I'm gonna give the MV1 a very solid 4 stars. And if you wanna check it out, of course, I've got it linked in the description. And while you're down there, if you found this review helpful, you having fun, happy Saturday evening, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Unless you're here live, in which case hang out, let's have a chat.